Now, Martinique Rhum is going to be the biggest deep dive we've done so far on an island, on a country that produces rum. Researching this video made my head go so I'll try and go through this as methodically and as clear as I possibly can. I've made a load of bullet points. I'm going to be trying to explain all that, but buckle up. Let's deep dive into Martinique. Now, to dumb this right down, Martinique is an island in the Caribbean. It's a French island. And we all know, like, if you're a spirits lover, we all know how, how religious, how methodical the French are when they come to spirits. So I'm going to refer back to this again, but think cognac, think Armagnac, think Calvados, think champagne. You know, they have plenty of rules and regulations about what you can and can't do when you make those products. And rum, Martinique Rhum, is no different. Now, there is a lot of history predating this, so I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to keep this as light as I possibly can. Bearing in mind, it does get very technical, but I'm going to take you back to the early 1900s, because this is when rum Agricole, French style Martinique rum kind of first became a proper thing. And this all started because effectively the requirement for them making sugar became less and less, simply because, and the UK is a big one for this, you know, my UK viewers, you will understand this. We grow a hell of a lot of sugar beet, which is actually quicker, cheaper and easier to kind of grow and cultivate and to turn it into sugar. So which meant all the cane that was being produced, that grown in Martinique, the amount of sugar that was kind of needed actually diminished. It became less and less, simply because sugar beet was growing more and more. So they had all this abundance of sugar cane. What else would they can do with it if they weren't producing sugar? Rum. Now, it is important to note before we go any further that it is not just cane juice rum that gets produced on Martinique. There is actually a little bit of molasses as well. I'll come to that in a bit, but don't think all rum from Martinique is actually made from cane juice. The majority is, but they do have molasses. Now, by the way, I think I said 1900s there a second ago. Actually, I meant 1800s, so early 1800s, because now we need to skip forward to sort of like the early 1900s, like late 1930s, early 1940s, because that is where one of the very first rules came in about Martinique rum. And that was simply to kind of protect the quality, because Martinique, obviously, as I've just explained, you know, they were starting to make a lot of rum. So they had a lot of export of rum. So the French being the French, you know, they like to guarantee the quality. Basically, there was a lot of rum just being produced and shipped out the door very, very quickly. Almost neutral in flavour. It was distilled to high ABVs, and there wasn't the quality to it. So the very first rule came in to govern what could and couldn't be rum on Martinique. And that rule or law was all about the minimum amount of volatile substances in the rum. Something we haven't really talked about yet. I've kind of mentioned it on the other channel when we did the plantation under the sea, and I'm going to use those rums as a reference point for you. So the one thing we can kind of assume about volatile substances is that they are actually directly referring to the kind of amount of flavour that's coming out of a rum. So I'm going to have to refer to the bullet points, the notes I've got here, because I can't remember this off the top of my head. But in the Plantation Under the Sea series, okay, I know we're talking about molasses, but this will paint you a picture, if you like. Out of the 6 rums we had, there was 57 grams per hectolitre in the Venezuelan rum, right up to 342 grams per hectolitre in the Fiji rum. But here are the big two that I want you to pay attention to. And these are volatile substances. Guyana had 179 grams per hectolitre and Barbados 113 grams per hectolitre. So to put that all into perspective, the minimum amount of volatile substances allowed in a French rum from Martinique is 225 grams. That is the bare minimum. And I keep forgetting to mention the word hectolitre. I've watched that back in a few videos. When I say this stuff, it is always grams per hectolitre of rum. So hopefully now you'll start to, and this is just tipping like the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully you've kind of start to appreciate like the flavours and the care and the pride that the French have in their rums, especially from Martinique. So I'm kind of going to take you forward now to like the 1970s. Now in 1971 it is reported that there's still equal amount of molasses rums being produced on the island of Martinique to cane juice rums. And this is when the very first kind of attempts to getting a proper AOC. You're going to love me. I'm going to try and say it. You know my French is bad, but Appellation de Contrôle. I already butchered that, didn't I? Appellation d'Origine Contrôle. You know, I'm terrible at pronouncing this sort of stuff. Orgeat, Orgeau, Orgeat, you get the idea. But effectively, the AOC. It was the first attempts to try and get an AOC, but it was kind of unsuccessful. So roll forward another sort of nearly 20 years. It was 20 years by the time it came in. They tried again in 1989, and that whole process took 6 or 7 years. And the full AOC that we're going to dive into effectively came into place in 1996. And the cool thing to tell you about that is actually the very first rum GI, or geographical indicator, basically rules and regulations. It was the very first. Now we are going to start to dive into this GI, into this AOC. But the one thing I want to clear up straight away is that the term Agricole, and this is where a lot of people get sort of lost and it's misunderstood. The term Agricole is not an AOC, it's not a GI. Agricole rum can be made anywhere in the world. Now, the point I want to make is Agricole essentially refers to agricultural, and therefore it's a French word. So you would naturally assume that the French would use it to on their rums, but that is not in itself a GI or an AOC or anything like that. Case in point, Husk in Australia make an Agricole, and there is nothing wrong with that. That is not against the laws. They're just using sugarcane juice rum or sugarcane juice to ferment. They produce a rum from that. They've called it Agricole. There is nothing wrong with that. So what is the actual AOC, and what you can sort of, if you pick up any bottle of Martinique rum and have a look for this, hopefully on the close up, I'll have to kind of point to it to find it where it is. But this is the rum St. James, right down there. Martinique, and these words directly above it. I can't even see to read the words of what they say, but you can see that on there. Appellation, what's it say? Appellation d'Origine Contrôle. That's what I've been trying to say, the AOC. That right there, if you see that on any bottle of Martinique rum, that is conformed to the rules and the regulations, the AOC. Now there's also a side point to note here as well, and this is my kind of opinion of things. I'm going to have a little rant here, a very quick rant, is because there are some rums from Martinique that actually don't conform to the AOC. Some of them very deliberetely. And there again, there is nothing wrong with that. We're going to be talking about like the rum JMs, for instance. There we go. These are not AOC rums. They do not conform to rules and regulations. However, are you trying to tell me that rum JM are not producing absolute quality rums? Of course they're not. The whole point is, and we'll talk about one specific distillery in a minute, but the whole point is rules are made to be broken. And I'm going to give you another example of this, because one of my favourite cognacs is actually not even a cognac, even though it's made in the cognac region of France. Okay? It's simply made differently. Again, you know, there might be slight things with the barrels. There might be slight things like it might be distilled out of season. Anything like that. So don't think for 1 minute, if it doesn't say the AOC, if it doesn't say Martinique on a bottle, don't think for 1 minute that's an inferior quality product, because it isn't. It's just in the new age, in the new era, certain distillers, certain brands are pushing those boundaries to create different rums. So here we go. Here's bullet point time of how I'm going to run down this, because I've got to refer to these bullet points. So let's dive straight in. And this is basic. This is kind of the abridged version. You know, we could go on for days about the whole sort of proper version, but this is the unabridged. So let's dive into what you must have to do to get this word Martinique and the appellation de Contrôle d'Origine. What's it called? Appellation de Contrôle. Oh, you know me, I can't say it properly. Orgeat. There we go. So what do you have to do to get these words on your bottle? Right. Rum must be distilled at 40% ABV, bottled at 40% ABV or higher. white or blanc rum, as they like to call it, must have at least 225 grams of volatile substances per hectolitre. But here we go. Here's the big bits that I haven't kind of mentioned. Matured rums, so slightly aged rums, must have a minimum of 250 grams of volatile substances per hectolitre. And aged rums, so 6-year-old, 8-year-old rums, you know, your VSOPs, your VSOPs, your, what else have we got? Your XOs, that sort of stuff. Okay, they must have at least 325 grams of volatile substances per hectolitre. Going back to the plantation Fiji, which had the most, what was that? 342 grams of volatile substances. So if you're aging your Agricole, your Martinique, your proper AOC, it must have at least 325 grams of volatile substances. Okay, that is pure flavour. Now moving on to the next part, we're going to be talking about the sugar cane. Now, the sugar cane must be, that they use, must be of certain varieties. Now, I can point to this because I found this out via plantation as well. On the island of Barbados, there is kind of like a sugar cane library, if you like. So if anything happens, if there's a world disaster and the sugar cane kind of, you know, gets eradicated in the Caribbean, there is kind of a library of sort of, I don't know what they want to call it, but basically they can regrow any type of sugar cane should it become extinct. They've got that capability to reproduce it if they want. That's what's held there in Barbados. Now, the whole point in that story, in that rum library, in that cane library, there are over 3,000 different types of sugar cane. So in France or in Martinique, they can only use certain varieties, okay? So they just can't go growing sugar cane willy-nilly. It has to be a certain type. But if they want to introduce a new cane variety and distill from that, it must have been growing in Martinique for at least 4 years. Okay, so I haven't really got my head around these yet completely, but what I think these are actually aged slightly differently, but actually slightly different types of sugarcane. So if you use a different type of sugarcane, for example, it ceases to become an AOC rum. Does it mean it's any poorer quality? No. Now to dive into a little bit further into the cane, and this very much is similar to like cognac and things like this, so we can get geeky about cognac. I'd love to get geeky with cognac one day with you, because there are so many kind of rules and regulations about this. But we're going to be talking about kind of, I was going to use the posh word, irrigation if you like, but watering your cane. So they're only allowed to water the cane 6 months of the year. So for the other 6 months of the year, you've got to rely on natural weather. You've got to rely on the sun. You've got to rely on water, to rainfall. Okay, you cannot use anything artificial to kind of cultivate that sugar cane. Now on that as well, harvesting, so cutting the cane essentially, can only be done between the 1st of January and the 31st of September every year. That is harvest season. So if you miss that window, if you've got cane, you probably wouldn't, but if you've got cane ready to go in October, November, December, you cannot use that. You cannot harvest that. And we'll come on to this in a second, but you can't distill it either. But the last thing, just to touch on the cane as well, cane, once harvested, must have a certain pH level. I can't get geeky about that, but then it also must have a certain amount of bricks to it as well. Now, bricks essentially, to dumb this right down, is the density of the sugar within that cane. All right, so that's kind of how sugar density is measured in bricks. So we've got the cane out of the way. Let's now talk about the fermentation and the distilling. So fermentation can only be done in a maximum of 500 litres in open vats. Okay, so this is important to note. They cannot use closed tanks. They cannot sort of store and keep that the CO2 that's produced. It must be open vats for fermentation in 500 litre quantities. And the ferments themselves can only be that kind of sugar cane juice with the yeast strains that they're using. Nothing else can be added. Now, this is going to be a really bad example, but I think for me, it's a good example to use because I've talked about these quite a lot. Just and this is no kind of, bear with me. So I'm going to talk about Goldstone rum here a minute, John and Gina. Now, I've spoken about their rums here in the UK. They use like a cocktail, I call it, of cane juice, of molasses, of, I call them jiggery pokery and paella, but jaggery and panela. Okay, so they use a sort of 4 different sugars in there. In Martinique rum, you can't in any of the fermentation. It is purely just sugar cane juice. Nothing else can be added except your kind of yeast strains that you kind of cultivating and to get your sugar cane juice to ferment. Now, fermentation times is a maximum of 120 hours. Bearing in mind the last sort of we were talking about is the Spanish origins, which were like 24, 48 hours at the very most, but most of them are like 24 hours. So up to 120 hours of fermentation, but the max ABV that you can go up to is 7.5, whereas we have discovered some rums are being sort of fermented up to 9% or as low as sort of 6%. But in Martinique, it's a maximum 7.5% ABV before it goes off to the still. So remember what I spoke about with the harvesting. Harvesting was between the 1st of January and the 31st of August. We're going to get into the distillation. The distillation can only occur on the 2nd of January through to the 5th of September. So obviously a day after harvesting can start and then 5 days essentially after harvesting finishes, okay? So you cannot even distill your rum in October, November, December. It's just not allowed, or even the bulk of September, okay? And that's very much part of cognac as well. That is a huge part of cognac. Cognac can only be distilled 6 months of the year, effectively. When we're talking about the stills, they cannot use pot stills, okay? Everything has to be column still, continuous column, and here's going to be some moments. This is what I referred to at the start of the video. Okay, so we'll come on to it in a second. But so obviously, and again, most brands would do this anyway. But separate, distinct stripping runs and rectifying runs and must be kind of done. Okay, so bearing in mind they have got a column still. You know, you must do a stripping run. Whereas a lot of brands would do continuous still where it just goes and goes and goes. There has to be separate kind of distillations, but you can't use a pot still to do this, all right? Right, stripping run, here we go. This is the moments you've all been waiting for. Right, stripping, the stripping part of the column, so the column they used to do the stripping run, must have at least 15 plates made of copper or stainless steel. The rectification column must have at least between 5 and 9 plates, okay, and only be made of copper. So no stainless steel in the rectification. It's all copper between 5 and 9 plates. And back to the stripping run, it's at least 15 plates or copper and stainless steel. I know you're going to be rewinding that to kind of listen to that again. But here we go, right? They've even got laws about the width, the diameter, if you like, of the columns. All right, I kid you not. So the columns, the column still, the diameter must be between 70 centimeters and 2 meters wide. Okay, they cannot go bigger than 2 meters wide. They cannot go smaller than 70 centimeters. Their columns must be within that margin, 70 centimeters to 2 meters. All right. And here's the thing that I really didn't know as well. The rums, when we're talking about distillation and final ABVs, if you like, again, we've spoken about it to do the kind of comparison to French, to Spanish kind of origin. We've got a lot of 92s, 93, 94% ABVs. With Martinique rum, they can only be distilled between 60, final off the stills can only be between 65 and 75% ABV. They cannot have anything below that or above that. Okay, 65 to 75% ABV rums. So again, going back to most of that lot up there, 90s, high 90s, okay, not in Martinique. Now we're nearly there, but there are a few more bits to kind of talk about. I'm sorry, I said this was going to be a long one, but hopefully we're kind of getting there. So, right, let's go on to once they've kind of finished distilling, so they've got their rums, we've got some AOC rules around this. So Blanc rums must be rested in tanks at least 6 weeks after distillation. So you can't just distill a rum and then sort of rest it for like a couple of days and then bottle it. It's got to be at least 6 weeks in effectively IBC containers, all right? So so that's got to be rested, Blanc rums, for 6 weeks. Matured rums have got to be aged in for at least 12 months in oak, American oak, essentially, all right? So any aged rum has to be at least 12 months old. Matured rums, that is. When we're talking about aged rums, so aged rums, we're talking anything that says sort of like VO, VSOP on the labels, anything like that. Must be aged in oak again, American oak, of 650 litres. So the maximum size a cask can be is 650 litres. And it must be aged for at least 3 years to be call it an aged rum. Okay, so they do have matured rums, but anything aged, like physically it's got view on the bottle, VIEUX, must be at least 3 years old in up to 650 litre casks for up to 3 years. And then vintage is anything above 6 years old, okay? So once a distillery has gone through all that, they've kind of kept their rules and regulations, they can now then get Martinique printed on the bottle. They can get this appellation de origin de contrôle printed on the bottle, but there's even rules and regulations about that. For instance, the Martinique must be the word Martinique must be directly below the apple or really near that. You can't have Martinique up here and the appellation AOC down there. You know, they've got to be in close proximity on the label, and the rum must be clearly marked as Blanc or Vieux. And when we're talking about Vieux, as in aged rums, just to give you the rough nuts and bolts with the letters that kind of you will see on French rums, pretty similar to cognac. VO means at least 3-year-old rum. VSOP, Reserve Spécial, Cuvée Spécial, and Très Vieux is at least 4 years old. And then Extra Vieux, Grand Reserve, Hors de, you know, D with the apostrophe H, Hors d'Age, and XO are at least 6 years old. I'll say that again. So Extra Vieux, Grand Reserve, XO, and Hors d'Age is at least 6-year-old rums. Now, I want to emphasize again, a distillery in Martinique has to go through all that if they want to put AOC and Martinique on their bottles. But that's not to say they have to. And that shouldn't be to say that AOC Martinique rums actually taste better in this day and age than non-AOC rums. As I said at the top, you know, distillers, you know, blenders, they all have different skill sets. We are learning all the time. There are new ways to do stuff. Okay, so just because a rum from Martinique doesn't say AOC, doesn't say Martinique on the actual label, give it a chance, because it might surprise you. Now, we've still got a bit to go in this, but this bit will be quite quick. We're going to be talking about the distilleries actually in Martinique. But before I get there, as I mentioned at the top, as I said, there are some molasses rums in Martinique as well, and they're actually quite famous. Now, we have to look at a brand like Le Galion, for instance. Galion makes something called a Grand Arome, or Grand Aroma, but Grand Arome essentially. Now, what that is, in dumbing that right down, and I don't think rum geeks will get too upset with me by going into this. Basically, what that is Martinique's answer to Jamaican high ester rums. A Grand Arome is a molasses rum, sort of made in the same style as a Jamaican funky rum, essentially. So if you see a Grand Arome from Martinique, it's not an Agricole, it is molasses based, but it will have bags of flavour to it. Now, we'll come back and feature Galion much further down the line after we've done the cane juice, because that is molasses. It would only be right to kind of do that after we've done cane juice, but we do need to focus on that. I've tried one and it's really tasty. So to finish up the video, we've got 10 distilleries to talk about. Again, I'm not going to go too in depth because I've got a lot of rums that we're going to feature in separate videos that I can kind of talk about that on, but just to run you through the distilleries first up. So again, bullet points here, because I'll never remember all this. Some famous ones, some ones I've never heard of before. First up, we've got St. James. Where's that? Right there, St. James Distillery. They do produce cane juice and molasses rums. Very much St. James, obviously, rum, but J. Bally also comes from there as well. And they produce 2.3 million litres of rum a year. Next up, another brand you will have heard of. I haven't got any here, but Depaz, D-E-P-A-Z. They are strictly cane juice, and they produce Depaz and Dillon. Maybe there's no I in it, but so I would go with some I-O-N. It's just O-N. So I'm going to call it Dillon. Sorry if that's not how you say it. But they produce 1.125 million litres of rum a year. We've got Le Mornay, which is actually owned by Campari, part of the Campari group. They are very much cane juice rums. And out of Le Mornay comes Le Mornay rum, comes Trois Rivières, that little bad boy. And I've heard this pronounced a couple of ways before, but I'm just going to say Duquesne, D-U-Q-U-E-S-N-E, Duquesne. think. I'm sorry. But that, you know, so you've got 3 big brands coming out of there. 2 million litres of rum a year. We've got Distillery de Simon, which is cane juice and is responsible now solely, as far as I know, for HSE. Okay, so that's where Distillery Simon. Now, it is important to note that the next one we're going to be talking about is Fons Preville, and that is cane juice. It is owned by Spiribam. So essentially, all Rhum GM, all Clément comes from Fons Preville. Now, the point I wanted to make is actually, up until recently, they did actually buy a lot of juice from the Simon distillery as well, especially for Clément, okay? So the Clément rums will be different in blends, different in rums, kind of these days. I think it's probably quite recently as well, sort of like mid-2010s, I think, is when that sort of ceases. But all rum now, Rhum GM, Rhum Clément, all comes from Fons Preville. As I say, owned by Spiribam, same people that own Chairman's Reserve as well. So there's Chairman's Reserve projects that they've got with cane juice. You're kind of getting the picture now. And they produce 1.5 million litres of rum a year. Here's one I've never heard of. We've got La Favorite as cane juice, produces La Favorite rum, and it's a private independent. Another new one I have not heard of, and I kind of like the idea of this. A1710. It is privately owned, it is independent, it is cane juice, but it is batch distilled and specifically and intentionally not an AOC rum. They want to buck the trend. They want to produce stuff that is not AOC, so they can produce rum in November. They can produce rum from different varieties of cane. They can do what they like because they are just intentionally not an AOC rum. So that's A1710. And then we've got, I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce this, SAEM, SAEM, and then PSRM. Prism, but that's where Le Galion comes from, and that is the molasses rum, and they produce 700,000 litres of rum a year, so about half the rest of the guys, the big guys. And then we've got Beau Séjour, which again I've not really heard of, but then we've got Nissan as well. Again, Nissan is not very much a thing in the UK, but I have heard a lot about it from the US, friends. So that is Martinique. That is a very long video. We better start reviewing and sort of tasting some of these rums now.